Welcome to another episode of the EvilTester Show, a podcast all about software testing and development. And in this episode, we have a discussion of a UK government guide to exploratory testing. And I'll put the links to the document in the show notes, where it's at gov.uk/service-manual/technology/exploratory-testing. And that's why I'm going to put the link in the show notes. But the aim is not to criticise the document. The aim is to use it as a base from which we can see how far our thoughts diverge or overlap with the document. Because I want to know what I can learn. This podcast was originally released to Patreon supporters in January of 2019, and I read through the document to try and understand the intent and meaning behind statements and offer my own thoughts. And the fact that I'm reading the document sounds like this will only work visually, and there is a video version, but all the points in the document I read aloud. So you can think through the points as I read them aloud and discuss them, because I'm thinking out loud during the podcast. And the reason for releasing this is not to say, look at this document is bad. The reason is to encourage people, or you, to build your own opinions about other people's work and accept them as alternative points of view, because we don't need to have a binary true or false world. People are allowed to have and present their own opinions, and they do have their own opinions. Our job is to have our opinions that we have thought through and can justify. So if we need to discuss them, then we're in a position to do so. And that's ultimately what I'm trying to do in this podcast. Fortunately, it's a document about exploratory testing, and I've got a lot of experience of exploratory testing, so I have opinions and thoughts on this subject. So before we start, a word from our sponsor, which is me, EvilTester.com, and we have online courses and books on software testing, and I'm going to encourage you to visit EvilTester.com/API challenges, which is an online application I've written to provide a fun playground for experimenting and learning about APIs. And there are a set of challenges which you can complete online and track your progress against. And now, thanks to that sponsor message, the podcast. So I put out a tweet a couple of days ago because in my Google searches, I've got predefined Google searches, Google alerts. So I've got a Google alert for exploratory testing. And one of the things that came back was this article from the UK government about how it describes exploratory testing. So I tweeted that out to see whether anyone else reacted to it. Now, I hadn't made up my mind about the article at that time. I thought what I'll do is we'll go through the article now and just give a running critique of it. And as I'm doing this, you can be thinking about it yourself as to whether you have different thoughts or opinions about it. And if you do, then if you leave them in comments, that'll be useful. Because one of the things I do recommend is it's important to get your head round what we mean when we talk about some of the words in testing. So if I ask you what is exploratory testing, you may not have verbalized that before. This is someone's attempt to verbalize it. Now, also what's interesting to me is this may or may not have been discussed. I have no idea how they let things go live on the government website. This is over 2 years ago, so it may not be up to date with whatever the general accepted definition or view of exploratory testing is. But I do remember looking at the start bit and going, what? So the goal of exploratory testing is to explore a system as a user would. For me, that's not necessarily the case. I very often do not explore the system as a user would. I very often use technical tools to help me get under the covers. I'm looking through a proxy. I'm bypassing the GUI to see how the server responds. So for me, that's a no. That's not how a user would. But that's one of the prerequisites of this definition. Everything in this definition, if it's going to be consistent, is underpinned by that. That's the first statement. Goal of exploring to explore a system as a user would. And then without a script to test a predetermined outcome. So I'm assuming that this means So I can't tell from this. This is ambiguous to me, and you might have a better grasp of English. Does this mean we're exploratory testing without a predetermined outcome? So this is without a script to test a predetermined outcome. Does that mean exploratory testing has no predetermined outcome? Or it just means without a script to tell us the predetermined outcome? So I'm not sure what that means. Because sometimes I'm testing with a predetermined outcome. I want to make sure that I can log in this application. I want to make sure that the application gives me an error message when these specific bits of data are put in. I have a predetermined outcome in mind. I'm not necessarily using a script. So does it mean the goal of exploratory testing is a system is a user without a script? I don't know. Tester is not looking into anything specific. Well, very often we are. We define in advance what we're going to do with charters. We have our aims. It is very specific. It's often very targeted. We know exactly what area we're exploring. We know what we're not exploring. We know what we're not considering at this point in time. What risks we are targeting. So I think that's not true. Instead, they use their knowledge, experience, and intuition to check a system. Because we do use our knowledge, and experience, and intuition to explore a system. That's interesting, the use of this word, given the current dynamics around the notion of checking versus testing. That's entirely the wrong word in the context that people argue about it. Possibly finding new defects as we go. Okay, so we want to find new defects as we go. That's fine. And we're using knowledge, experience, and intuition. Now, at this point, what is exploratory testing to you? So for me, given my model of testing, which is having a model of the system and comparing that against the system in various ways, I'm using exploratory testing to find information that allows me to expand my model. Because if I'm expanding my model, I'm being surprised by the information coming back. I'm learning something new. I'm exploring. I'm discovering something new. Those are some of the words that I expect to see associated, or I have associated with exploratory testing. Discovery, exploration, new, information. So here we've got new defects, but I'm also interested in new information, new parts of the system that are of interest, new technology layers that may or may not have problems. So there's an extra set of nuances in there. All right, so the value of exploratory testing: detect subtle or complex bugs in a system, might even detect really simple bugs that are not detected in targeted testing. We might not be using any targeted testing. So the value of exploratory testing here is bugs. The value of exploratory testing is provides user-oriented feedback. Not when I do it, because it's rarely user-oriented. And if you want user-oriented, get the users doing it. Business analysts can provide user-oriented feedback. Like exploratory testing, you want done by some of the best people that you can, and it's not necessarily user-oriented at that point. New and undiscovered problems. Okay, contrast with other more prescribed methods of testing. Okay, does that mean scripted? Okay, such as, completely different, test automation, which aims to show scripted tests can complete successfully without defects. So I agree that that is a relatively good view of test automation as used for the purposes of continuous integration to show that scripted tests can be complete without defects. So I'm not sure about the exploratory testing, but the test automation part seems fine. Done well, exploratory testing will help you write new automated tests to ensure problems aren't repeated. Okay, well, done badly, exploratory testing might help you write new automated tests to ensure problems aren't repeated because you do stuff. How at all does exploratory testing help you write new automated tests? Does this mean that because you're doing exploratory testing, you have covered an area, therefore you're fairly sure that that area works, therefore you know what paths you can put through, therefore you can then cover it? Or does it mean you use exploratory testing to find problems, which you then automate that particular route and then ensure that problems aren't repeated because it's automated and you can continually check? Not sure what that means. Who does it? Okay, ideally performed by experienced testers, but then we're wasting those experienced testers on like testing like a user. That doesn't seem like a good focus. Quality assurance testers have analytical skills, okay, an ability to behave like users. I very often lack the ability to behave like a user. A knack for finding defects. Okay, I mean, this is just any tester, right? you want, particularly scripted testers, you want analytical skills because you have to come up with the scripts in the first place. So this is not exploratory or non, this is just testers. Business analysts have an uncanny ability to behave like users. Front-end designers, programmers also have an uncanny ability to behave like users because they will go through the standard paths. Testers normally have an uncanny ability to behave entirely unlike users, and that is how we have a knack for finding defects. All right, so long as testers can test, we've got the necessary testing skills. Other people, all right, so anyone who has testing skills can do explorative testing. So business analysts, product managers, subject matter experts, and these are all people who, this might be because explorative testing is related to users in this view. Therefore, people who do test like users can do explorative testing in this perspective. These people tend to know the system, what it should be able to do, and are therefore well suited to testing it. Well, again, that's not necessarily a prerequisite of explorative testing. If you know what a system should do, are you then well suited to test it? If you know what a system should do, then you are well suited to exercise paths with predetermined outcomes, but you might be biased because of the knowledge that you currently have. And a lot of the things that we have to do with testing is overcoming the bias that our existing knowledge has, which is why when I'm thinking about it, I'm thinking about it as explorative testing because I've got a model, I'm comparing the model with the system. I want to expand that model. I want to overcome my bias of my existing knowledge. I want to go around that rather than continue to follow those paths. When should we do it? When there's enough functionality to interact with it in a meaningful way. But we can do explorative testing on nothing by asking questions and exploring the models that people have to see if it's going to get built in a correct way. So I don't agree with this. Explorative testing works best in those areas. Exploratory testing works best on a system where you want to see whether it works functionally when the system has functionality that you can use. I mean, a lot of this is tautological for me. Like, it only makes sense in the sense that it's written. This could be before you release blah, blah, blah. How to do it. Okay, let's look at how to do it. Explorative testing may sound ad hoc, but it is disciplined and requires specific techniques. Okay, so what are those specific techniques? Okay, so we should state a goal, right? So we're not looking at anything specific, but we should state a goal. All right, so we should document all our queries and observations during the testing session, capture evidence as notes, screenshots, and first testing. So that all sounds good. When you do explorative testing, you should document it. Document your queries, your observations, your concerns, your risks, the defects that you find, anything that you want to do in the future, or your questions. That is a good thing. Note down ideas for further testing. Yep, that all seems good. So at this point, this seems useful. Explorative test discovers a bug can be developed into a test scenario and automated. So that's what they meant by good exploratory testing can be used to drive automated execution. So this makes the assumption then that automated execution is for bug replication and not just for coverage of execution paths through the system. Now I think unit tests are good for bug replication, so that you write unit tests for that bug at as low level as humanly possible, so that when it's fixed, you know it's not coming back again. But if you do that at a high level, at some point you're probably going to end up deleting that test because it only adds value for a bug replication. But at a high level, you want your automated execution to cover paths and flows to assure that things work. And targeting bugs at a high level is probably a waste of execution. You really want to get bug assurance flows further down into the technical stack. But it doesn't say at what level this will be automated. To achieve best results, apply the techniques of test charters, mind maps, and time boxing. Okay. Test charters explain a mission without being prescriptive. Okay. Charter won't detail what problems you're looking for. Well, it might. Right? There's nothing to say that your test charter can't be a problem investigation charter. So you can have charters that are about investigating problems. That's perfectly valid. Perfectly valid. Which part of the system you're looking at? Okay, goals. Who is testing the system? Well, not necessarily. And when you make your logs, you'll say who it is that's done it, but the charter might not, but your logs will. When and where, yet again, put that in your logs. Test environment, good idea to put that in your logs. Any test data you're using, absolutely. When you're writing your test down, do write down the data that you're using. That's a good idea. Hopefully your system is logging things. You can capture logs later on. So the only thing I think I disagree with there is won't detail your problems, because it might. Mind maps. Some testers use mind maps. Now it's interesting because very often people think of mind maps as a visual thinking tool, but very often a mind map, particularly when we use tools to do this, it's simply an outline, a hierarchy wrapped around a globe. So normally a hierarchy is an outline, is a vertical statement with a tree structure. But with a mind map, it's kind of transformed topologically onto a circle in order to give us that graph view, that more oversight view, because a hierarchy can be very long and hard to actually look through. But a mind map is much more of a graph. So it's not, in that sense, it's not necessarily a visual thinking tool. It's certainly a visual representation, but it's no more of a visual representation than an outline. So I caution you that when you think about mind maps to me are really very ad hoc descriptions of information where the order is less important and it is much more about the scope and the ideas that it triggers, or rather than being a time-bound execution log. Now, interestingly, I find that my exploratory testing logs are very good for time-bound logs. I like to have time-bound logs for exploratory testing because then I can see how my thinking built up. When I find an issue, the timestamp, what it relates back to. Mind maps, if you are doing it in a linear fashion, you are losing some of the benefits of a mind map, because a mind map you want the ability to organically build up and say, well, I'm in this area, I'll do these things, and then I'll come over and I'll look at these areas, and then I'll come back here. And you lose that time-bound nature. So I think you have to be, there's nothing wrong with mind maps. Using mind maps is fine, using a tool like that. But sometimes the logging notion of time is very useful for testing. As a organization of your ideas, a mind map might be useful in extra queries and questions because you can organize it. Very often, what I have done in the past is I'll make time-bound notes. When I care about this kind of stuff, like I want to collate all my questions, I want to collate all my issues together because they'll be dotted around a time-bound document. Then I might parse the document to give me a list of issues, a list of questions. I think the John and James session-based tool might have done that at some point. If you gave it the right tag, it gave you a list of questions, a list of issues. Certainly I wrote something that did that at some point. Don't tend to use that anymore. I only use that on certain sites when we're trying to explain things. I just find that's a bit too formal for most of the activities we conduct it in. But it might be useful in certain places to organize that information out. Suit explorative testing because it's quick and easy to record and don't follow a linear approach. Sometimes you want that linear approach, so it varies. But mind maps get a lot of press. I just caution you, I think most of the time people use them as outlines rather than mind maps, and you might lose something. Always be aware of what you're losing when you put this in. You gain the ability to structure your information and organization, but you might lose the time-bound nature. If there was a way of capturing this, so you had a custom mind map tool that when you wrote things, it knew what order you added things in, and you could extract those logs in a time-bound fashion, that would be the best, almost the best of both worlds. But I've never seen that. Right, time boxing. This is important. It is important to set a time limit because it helps you focus. You can still drift off in unfocused exploration. That's still perfectly valid. You just have to be aware at what point you do it, and you end at a certain point. So set a limit can be useful because it is unscripted and unpredictable. Setting a limit is useful because all testing is essentially unbounded. You can keep going. So we artificially limit in time so that we're forced to constantly prioritize. We know we're getting to the end of the time. Have we done enough in this time? Have we been on track? And force that time pressure. But I don't think it's because it is unscripted and unpredictable. The next test you do may be based on the previous test results. It may not be, right? You might have previous test results and just raise things as questions and not follow them up. So at some point, your test will be influenced by previous. And I'm not even sure that's an inspect and adapt model. See, at the end of your testing, you do a retrospective, which would be your inspect and adapt. If, as you test, you continually inspect and adapt the results you're getting, you may lose focus on the charter. Remember, we've set out a charter which is focused. If we continually inspect and adapt as we go through, we may never complete the charter. So I'm not necessarily sure I agree with that. This is interesting. Read more about these techniques in Session-Based Testing by Jonathan Bach, which takes us to James's website, where it's James's description, and then he describes the material in detail. If you haven't read Session-Based Test Management, I think it's a good thing to read. Okay, reporting on it. Depending on who you're testing, you need to share results. Okay, you clearly probably want to communicate your results. You might want to document, well, you absolutely want to document your charter, what you've tested, how you conducted your testing, notes, list of issues, questions, action material. I don't think this is a might. I think this is an absolutely. This is mandatory when you do it. If you're not doing this, I don't think you are doing exploratory testing. I think you are just doing ad hoc exploration, and you might get lucky. This, to me, is the key that distinguishes a good exploratory tester from someone who is learning it, or someone who is a dilettante in this area, someone who is practicing it, still learning, or someone who is pretending to be it but hasn't quite mastered it. Good notes are massively important. Now remember, you can make notes as mind maps, so hopefully you are documenting this stuff. You can also report how much you spent on. So this is certainly what session-based test management emphasizes, the how much time you put into the different areas. Sometimes I will map this back, because I tend to make linear notes and they're time bound. I can look at my notes and then go, right, how much time did I spend on creating an execution test? I'll look through timestamp, creating, timestamp, executing, and calculate it that way. But very often, because you're only really doing 45 minutes or an hour, it's probably clear in your memory roughly how much time you went. I'm reading a book, I don't have it here beside me, called Protocol Analysis, which is it's by Herbert Simon and someone else, and it's about the verbal reporting of data, which is in some way analogous to this, because although we're not verbally reporting, very often we're writing things down in a stream, or I am writing things down in a stream of consciousness. So I think the protocol analysis is interesting in this, and part of that is, depending on how much time has elapsed and depending on how much thinking aloud you have done, it changes how you can report at the end. So if you have done a lot of documentation as you go through, whether it's time-stamped or mind maps, you're probably in a better position to estimate this than if you didn't make any notes. If you didn't make any notes, you will find it very hard to estimate this and come up with the figures. But certainly James, Michael, and John all emphasize this as one of the useful ways of reporting. On an Agile project, I think this is actually less relevant, because what is important on an Agile project is that you're very often testing on a story-by-story basis. You've got a much smaller set of criteria. You're probably going to be testing in 30 minutes, 45 minutes. So this is much less important. What's much more important is the coverage on the story and the information that has arisen from your testing. There are many tools, e.g. fully automated video capture. Hardly anyone does this. Logging tools. So I think this is a good reminder that anything that you can do to log your testing and system automatically, you should take advantage of. So if your system generates logs, find a way of cutting out, for the time period that you were testing, the logs that are relevant to you. If you're doing web traffic, go through a proxy and save the session that you tested in terms of the traffic. Anything that you can use to automatically do this supports later reflection and useful. Planning tools, doesn't say what they are. Is this Gantt charts? What is this? Because very often, if you're coming up with charters, so if this was in Jira, I might well have charters as a list somewhere of things I want to test, but more likely they're just going to be a list of bullets on a story. Walls full of process diagrams and feature descriptions. Okay, this is sounding less and less like exploratory testing. However, the only tools you really need are pen and some paper. So I rarely use pen and paper. I normally use a text editor. But if I had to, pen and paper, it's just that pen and paper implodes for me because my writing is unreadable after a while. I think if I had to rely on things like non-IT tools, I would at that point probably use a mind map. I would much more likely use a mind map as an organic pen and paper type system than a log. Logs work well for me because I'm using text files. So maybe that would be the distinction between a log and a mind map. Other tools nice to have, but don't put your testing out of access. So that's certainly true. You can do exploratory testing without tools, but you do have to have some ability to log simply because it aids recall. And it aids recall in terms of coverage and thought processes, and you want the ability to make notes of things you will do in the future and things you have done. So I think I disagree with a lot of that at a kind of nuanced level. I don't mind if people put these things up. Now, normally, when people put things out, I don't critique it. What I normally do is I'll put out an alternative that represents my view. Right? I think it's much better to just offer an alternative. So when we've gone through this, now remember, I've done an exploratory process on this. I don't even remember what I have said about this. I tried making notes, but because I'm speaking at the same time, making notes was impacting my thought processes, which again I find interesting. That's why I'm reading that protocol analysis book, to see what the research is in terms of how you verbally report, which is what I'm doing now, versus how you write things down and the distinctions between it. Because if you were doing pair exploratory testing, you would be chatting between each other, at which point an audio recording of what you're doing might be enormously important, right? Because it covers your ideas, it covers everything else. It might even be worth audio recording what you're doing as a pair and get it transcribed on rev.com and automatically receiving a log back. If you test for an hour, you put it into Rev, 60 minutes of material, that's $60. If you factored that cost in, you might come up with a really good set of logs for your testing. It might even be really, and that would be timestamped. So you've got automatic timestamps of when you said things, because you know when you started and you know at what point in the audio it happens. I don't think that's something that I've seen anyone do, but it might be something that's worth considering if you were doing a lot of verbal stuff, because I think writing things down, but if you're working in pairs, doing things verbally allows someone else to make notes while someone else is doing the work. So you can trade off the responsibilities at that point. But normally I don't critique these things, but because this is coming through from the government and it's public, and essentially I've paid for it as a taxpayer, I feel not necessarily duty bound, but I'm interested in how other people present things, because it helps me get a handle on my thoughts around this. So I encourage you to do this yourself. I have no idea how long this video went on for, but I encourage you to do this yourself. Right? Go through, think about this one. Now, you don't have to be limited to this. We've done this one. You can look at my responses. Feel free to go through and look for their accessibility testing. They've got vulnerability and performance penetration testing, general quality assurance. I haven't read these in detail either. Performance testing. But look through those and go, right, how do I or you feel about that? How does it relate to what you're thinking? And get your head around your models of it. There is very possibly something important to learn in there that you haven't necessarily got, and it will emphasize to you what you believe is important about this particular definition. So this is a useful exercise for me. I will be watching this video back to see what I said. So hopefully there's some useful information in there, but I encourage you to do this type of thing. Don't necessarily respond online, but do use it as an opportunity to get your head around the thing that someone else has described and defined. Well then, I found that a useful exercise, and I encourage you to repeat the exercise for yourself and build your own opinions, because this will help you question or possibly reinforce your own beliefs. And if you found this content useful, then subscribe wherever you found this podcast and visit EvilTester.com, where you can subscribe to the blog or the email newsletter. And I try to create this content to share my experience and encourage you to build your own experience through experimentation. And you can support this podcast by buying any of our affordably priced ebooks and online training courses over at EvilTester.com, or join us on Patreon at patreon.com/EvilTester, where I publish daily blog posts of behind the scenes information, testing tutorials, a whole bunch of stuff. And hopefully I'll see you online or in the next episode of the EvilTester show. But thanks for tuning in.